Huang had walked these trails since he was a boy. Every bend in the river, every hidden stream, every game path that snaked between the strangler figs. He knew them the way a man knows the lines on his own palm. For 2 years now, he had been the quiet artery feeding the D445 battalion. Rice sacks carried at night, medical supplies slipped through villages, ammunition crates moved under moonlight. The Americans roared through with their helicopters and their artillery, but they never found him. They never found anyone. Huang would watch their patrols from the canopy, smell the lucky strikes and the insect repellent from half a kilometer away, and smile. The jungle belonged to them. The foreigners were only visitors. Then the quiet began to change. First, it was the sentries. One morning, the dawn watch simply failed to return to the cooking fire. They found him sitting upright against a tree, throat opened with a single clean cut, eyes still open. No sign of struggle, no footprints within 10 meters. The next night, another sentry vanished. No scream, no shot, no blood trail, just gone. Then the rice caches started disappearing. Entire bamboo platforms, hundreds of kilos of grain, would be there at dusk and empty by dawn. No drag marks, no wheel ruts, nothing. The men began whispering that the spirits were angry. Huang tried to laugh it off. He told the younger fighters it was American long-range snipers, or maybe traitors in the villages. But the fear grew teeth when they found the first body, arranged like the old stories his grandmother used to tell. Arms crossed over the chest, eyes closed, with 2 small leaves placed on the lids. A single red flower tucked between the fingers, as if the dead man had been prepared for a funeral no one attended. No one had heard a sound. No one had seen a shadow. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Supplies vanished. Men died without warning. Patrols returned smaller than they left. And always the same eerie stillness afterward. No spent casings, no broken branches, no scent of gun oil or sweat that did not belong to their own. Huang stopped sleeping. He began to believe the stories the old men in the hamlets had whispered for generations. Maroom, jungle ghosts, beings that moved without touching the earth, that killed without anger, that watched without being seen. He started jumping at the rustle of leaves. He prayed to ancestors he had long stopped honoring. The jungle, once his home, had become a place that stared back. But it was not spirits. It was men. Very few men. Very carefully made men. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR. And that was exactly how they worked in the jungles of Vietnam. November 1967, Phuoc Tuy Province. An American intelligence captain sat inside a sweltering Australian command tent, sweat soaking through his fatigues, staring at a battered field notebook that had just been dropped onto the table with the casual flick of a wrist. 3 days earlier, he had run one of the largest search and destroy sweeps the province had seen. 150 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, Huey gunships overhead, artillery batteries dialed in, napalm pods stacked and ready. They had swept grid after grid. They had found nothing. No bunkers, no caches, no enemy main force. 12 Americans wounded by punji stakes and tripwires. 2 helicopters limping home with ground fire damage. 0 confirmed kills. The D445 battalion had vanished like smoke. Now the same captain was looking at the patrol report of 5 Australian SAS operators who had lived in that same jungle for 21 days. No air support, no resupply drops, no artillery. Just 5 men with rifles, binoculars, and notebooks. The notebook contained exact grid references for 17 enemy positions, timetables for 3 Viet Cong companies moving through the sector, locations of 2 underground dispensaries, names and villages of 4 cadre chiefs quietly feeding rice to the communists. Intelligence the entire American division had failed to gather, with every technical asset at its disposal. Then the Australian patrol sergeant reached into his rucksack and laid something else on the table. A hand-drawn map. 60 square kilometers of triple canopy jungle rendered in pencil and meticulous detail. Every trail, every stream ford, every likely ambush point, every concealed cache. The Americans had RF-4 Phantom reconnaissance photos of the same ground. Beautiful high-altitude black and white images that showed only an endless green ceiling. This map showed the world beneath the leaves, a world their technology could not touch. The captain felt his stomach turn over. 5 men had done what 5,000 could not, and they had done it by being nowhere at all. In 1957, long before the first Australian boots touched Vietnamese soil, the Australian Army made a decision that would one day humiliate entire divisions of the most powerful military on Earth. They took a handful of carefully selected soldiers and sent them into the remote wilderness of Western Australia, not for conventional jungle training, but to learn from men who had survived the harshest landscape on the planet for 40,000 continuous years. Aboriginal trackers. These were not classroom sessions or weekend exercises. The soldiers lived with the trackers for months on end in country that could kill a man in a day. No water for 50 kilometers, temperatures swinging 40 degrees between noon and midnight. Venomous everything. They learned to read a story in a single bent blade of spinifex grass that had been stepped on 3 days earlier. They learned to distinguish the faint, sour tang of human sweat from the 1,000 other smells of the bush. They learned to move across open ground without casting a shadow that could be read from a ridgeline 2 kilometers away. They learned silence, not just the absence of noise, but the absence of disturbance. By 1962, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment had taken those ancient skills and forged them into something new, a formal doctrine of invisibility. While American Green Berets at Fort Bragg were drilling on calling in arc light strikes and coordinating battalion-sized air mobile assaults, the men at Campbell Barracks in Perth were learning the opposite: how to become a rumor the enemy could never prove. The philosophical gulf was absolute. American doctrine in Vietnam rested on presence, show overwhelming force, project power, draw the enemy into contact where American firepower, artillery, TAC-air, gunships, could annihilate him. It was the logic of industrial warfare, refined in 2 world wars and Korea. It assumed that the side that could bring the most metal downrange fastest would win. Australian doctrine rested on absence. The man who is not detected owns the battlefield, no matter how many tons of ordnance the other side can drop. Do not announce yourself. Do not invite battle. Become the shadow that moves through the enemy's rear areas while he is still looking for the main attack that never comes. The numbers that resulted from those 2 philosophies were obscene in their disparity. Across the entire war, large-scale American operations averaged a kill ratio of roughly 10 to 1. Impressive, until you remember the price tag. 7 million tons of bombs dropped across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, more than all the bombs of World War II combined. 15 billion rounds of small arms ammunition expended, hundreds of billions of dollars burned, and still, in province after province, the Viet Cong infrastructure endured. The Australian SAS numbers told a different story. Throughout their deployment, The regiment achieved a confirmed kill ratio approaching 500 to 1. 500. In total, they lost only a handful of men to direct enemy action, while accounting for over 500 confirmed enemy killed, and many times that number through intelligence they provided to follow-on forces. They did it with patrol sizes that rarely exceeded 5 men. They did it with ammunition expenditures so low that a single patrol might fire fewer rounds in a month than an American rifle company burned in a morning firefight. They did it with almost zero dependence on air support or artillery. One 5-man patrol could sustain itself in the jungle for weeks on what an American company consumed in a single day of helicopter resupply. The difference was not courage. Both sides had that in abundance. The difference was philosophy made manifest in technique. The Americans wanted the enemy to know they were coming. The Australians wanted the enemy to doubt they had ever been there at all. And in the green hell of Phuoc Tuy province, that single inversion of logic turned 5 men into something the Viet Cong would eventually call ghosts. To become invisible in a jungle that already belonged to the enemy required more than training. It required transformation. 3 days before insertion, the ritual began. The 5 men stopped using soap, toothpaste, deodorant, anything that carried the chemical signature of the West. They switched to captured Viet Cong rations, plain rice, nuoc mam fish sauce, dried shrimp. The goal was simple and ruthless. Change the chemistry of their own bodies until even the faintest whiff of their sweat no longer screamed foreigner. They rubbed themselves with crushed local leaves and sometimes with animal dung collected far from trails, letting the jungle's own smells overwrite their own. Uniforms were soaked in river water and dried without detergent. Every buckle, every zipper, every loose strap was taped or removed. Boots were wrapped in strips of cloth to muffle sound and obscure tread patterns. Once on the ground, the discipline became absolute. Radio silence was the default. American patrols checked in every 30 minutes. The crackle of their transmissions could be triangulated from kilometers away by even basic Viet Cong direction-finding gear. Australian SAS patrols routinely went dark for a week or more. When they did transmit, it was in short, encrypted bursts sent only at prearranged windows, and even then, only if absolutely necessary. They communicated with hand signals refined from Aboriginal hunting techniques. A subtle tilt of the wrist for enemy near, fingers splayed for wait, a slow curl for move. In moments of maximum stealth, they might go 10 full days without a single spoken word. No coughs, no sneezes, no whispers. The psychological toll of that level of silence was immense. Men learned to suppress even the instinct to clear their throats, but it was non-negotiable. Sound was death. Movement was slower still. An American infantry squad might push 15 or 20 kilometers in a day, leaving a highway of broken branches, crushed undergrowth, and boot prints that a halfway competent tracker could follow for days. An SAS patrol might cover 2 or 3 kilometers in the same period and leave almost nothing behind. They practiced what they called ghost walking. Each foot was placed with exquisite care. The ball of the foot touched first, testing for dry leaves or twigs that might snap. Only when the ground accepted the weight did the heel come down. A single step could take 5 or 6 seconds. In the tightest sections, where maximum concealment was required, a 5-man patrol might take a full minute to advance 1 meter. Every hand that brushed foliage did so deliberately, bending leaves back rather than breaking them, restoring them to their original position as the man passed. They moved in single file, the last man responsible for gardening, erasing the faint signs the others might have left, smoothing dirt with a stick, replacing disturbed stones, brushing away footprints with a leafy branch. Even their breathing was controlled, slow, shallow, through the nose to minimize noise and visible condensation. The result was a kind of negative space on the battlefield, where American units announced themselves with helicopter noise, cooking fires, cigarette smoke, and the pervasive smell of Western hygiene products and gun oil. The Australians left only absence. No trail, no scent, no sign. The Viet Cong, masters of concealment themselves, found their own detection networks useless. Informants in the villages reported nothing. Tripwires remained undisturbed. Scent dogs brought in by American units circled and whined in confusion. And that was precisely the point. The patrol did not exist until it chose to. When it finally acted, the enemy would have no warning, no pattern to predict, no ghost to hunt. Only the sudden, surgical violence of men who had already been inside their perimeter for days. The real devastation came not from body counts, but from what the Australians called infrastructure interdiction. They did not hunt for big firefights. They hunted the things that kept the Viet Cong alive. A rice cache discovered meant weeks of hunger for an entire company. A courier captured meant weeks of disrupted communications. A trail ambushed meant supply lines that had to be rerouted or abandoned entirely. Every small cut bled the enemy slowly, methodically, until entire sectors became untenable. Their signature tactic, the spider's web ambush, was lethal poetry in motion. A 5-man patrol would study a trail network for days, sometimes weeks. They did not set one ambush, they set several, interconnected killing zones spread across kilometers of jungle, each covering a different junction or choke point. 2-man teams would melt into concealed positions, one man observing, the other ready with the rifle. When an enemy column entered the web, the Australians did not open fire immediately. They watched. They waited. They let the point man pass the first position, the main body commit to the trail, the rear elements close the distance. Only when the formation was stretched and vulnerable, usually at a narrow ford or a sharp bend, did the first shot come. A single, suppressed round. The point man dropped without a sound. Before the column could react, the shooter was already ghosting to a secondary hide. Panic rippled through the survivors. They fired wildly into the trees. They charged toward the muzzle flash that no longer existed, and walked straight into the second position. A second shot. Another body down. The survivors turned again, only to trigger the third. The web tightened. Men ran in circles, screaming orders that made no difference. The Australians never stayed in one place longer than necessary. They struck, displaced, struck again, herding the increasingly terrified enemy from one kill zone to the next, like predators driving game. Documented engagements showed the absurdity of the ratios. 5 men against 50 or more, 20 to 30 enemy casualties inflicted. 0 Australian losses. In one August 1968 action, a 4-man patrol engaged a near company-sized Viet Cong force, nearly 100 men. Over 6 hours of running contact, they killed 23 confirmed, wounded perhaps 40 more. Total ammunition expended, under 200 rounds. The survivors fled the entire district and did not return for 3 months. The psychological wound cut deeper than the bullets. Viet Cong documents captured later spoke of growing dread. Patrols that vanished without trace. Sentries found dead in the night, arranged with leaves over the eyes or flowers in their hands. Echoes of local ghost stories. Supply caches blown with precise charges, leaving only scorch marks and the faint smell of plastic explosive. equipment rearranged in patterns that suggested ritual rather than combat, bodies positioned to face the rising sun or laid out as if sleeping peacefully. The communists began calling the Australians marung, jungle ghosts, forest phantoms. The term carried real terror. Hardened fighters who had endured B-52 strikes without flinching started refusing assignments in sectors where the marung were rumored to operate. Entire companies avoided trails they had used for years. Commanders reported to higher that the jungle itself had turned hostile. It was deliberate. The SAS understood that in a guerrilla war, perception was often more powerful than firepower. They cultivated the myth. A carved symbol on a tree here, a strange arrangement of spent casings there, a dead man's hand left pointing toward a village that had been supplying the Viet Cong. Small, calculated acts of psychological warfare that amplified every tactical success into something supernatural. The effect was cumulative and profound. Men who once moved confidently through their own backyard began to hesitate. They looked over their shoulders. They whispered at night. Morale eroded, not from heavy losses alone, but from the simple, grinding certainty that something was watching, and that it could reach out and touch them whenever it chose. 5 men, 1 patrol, 1 province slowly strangled, and the enemy never once saw their faces. The American officer who sat in that tent in November 1967 never forgot what he saw. He wrote the report anyway, classified immediately, circulated to a narrow circle in MACV and the Pentagon, buried within weeks. In crisp, professional language that still carried the sting of professional humiliation, he described the notebook, the map, the patrol logs. He compared the Australian results to American operations in the same province. He concluded that the SASR approach, built on stealth, patience, intelligence, and minimal signature, represented a model for counterinsurgency that the United States was structurally incapable of adopting. Not because the men lacked skill, not because the tactics were unproven, because the cultural, logistical, and doctrinal foundations of the American military were built for a different kind of war. The report recommended pilot programs, small experimental units trained in Aboriginal-derived tracking, radio silence, ghost walking, infrastructure-focused operations. It was dismissed, not refuted, simply set aside. Body counts, ground taken, villages pacified. Those were the metrics that mattered in Saigon briefings and congressional hearings. 5 men quietly dismantling enemy logistics did not photograph well. 100 Viet Cong bodies laid out on a trail did. The tragedy played out in predictable stages. American liaison officers rotated through Australian units. They came back impressed, uneasy, and ignored. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated American combat leaders of the war, wrote openly about what he saw. The Aussies did more with a battalion than we did with 10 times the men and machines. He tried to adapt elements of their doctrine in his own command. He was quietly sidelined. Operation Lam Son 719 in 1971 became the final bloody proof. 25,000 South Vietnamese troops, massive American air and artillery support, aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. An Australian intelligence assessment prepared months earlier warned that the plan was doomed. Too large, too noisy, too dependent on firepower the enemy could see coming from afar. The assessment recommended small, covert teams for precision mapping and interdiction. It was ignored. The operation collapsed. Over 50% South Vietnamese casualties. Dozens of American helicopters lost. The trail barely slowed. 1 small Australian-advised Ranger battalion, trained in SASR stealth techniques, achieved its objectives, and withdrew with light losses. The success was noted in after-action reports. Nothing changed. The institutional momentum was unbreakable. Yet the ghost strategy refused to die quietly. When the U.S. military finally rebuilt its special operations community in the late 1970s and 1980s, after the failures of Desert One, Beirut, and the early lessons of the post-Vietnam era, the Australian model was studied intently. Delta Force drew heavily on SAS organizational structure, selection philosophy, and training emphasis. The modern American Special Operations triad, small units, extreme stealth, intelligence primacy, owes more than is usually admitted to those five-man patrols in Phuoc Tuy province. One element, however, was never fully embraced: the deliberate cultivation of supernatural dread. The carved symbols, the ritualistic body placement, the myth-making. Defenders argued it saved lives by keeping enemy forces out of entire sectors. Critics called it psychological brutality that blurred ethical lines. The Australian Army itself has remained reticent. Certain files remain sealed more than half a century later. The numbers, though, are merciless. From 1966 to 1971, Australian forces in Vietnam suffered 521 deaths from all causes. Peak strength around 8,000. Adjusted for size, their casualty rate was roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the American rate, despite operating in some of the most contested terrain. The explanation lies almost entirely in doctrine. The Americans asked, "How much force can we apply?" The Australians asked, "What is the smallest signature we can leave?" One question led to bases the size of small towns, constant helicopter traffic, endless resupply convoys, and 58,000 names on a black granite wall. The other led to 5 men who could control a province for weeks, leave no trace, and walk away untouched. The jungle has reclaimed the trails now. The base camps are gone. The tunnels have caved in. Vietnam has healed in ways no one in 1967 could have imagined. But in training compounds from Fort Bragg to Campbell Barracks, in the silent night movements of modern special operators, in the principle that the man who is not seen controls the fight, the ghost strategy lives. It was never adopted in time to change Vietnam. It was adopted, eventually, because Vietnam proved the old way could not win. 5 men, 1 battered notebook, a doctrine the Pentagon buried for 40 years, and a question that still echoes in every irregular war since. What if we had listened?